What is going on, guys, and welcome back to Touchdowns to Home Runs. My name is Bernie. Thank you for joining us today on the Touchdowns to Home Runs show. Hope that your day is going absolutely fantastic. We are finally at fight night, with the main card tonight being Ben Askren and Jake Paul, the very, very anticipated fight. Now, a lot of people see this as just sort of a joke fight, but I think a lot of people are also going to be tuned in tonight to really see what these two guys are all about. You're obviously talking about a former Disney and YouTube star in Jake Paul, and then a guy in Ben Askren who does have the more fighting experience, but of course coming over from MMA and actually no experience in the boxing world. So I think it's going to be interesting. Today we're sort of just going to be doing a preview, a breakdown, giving everything you need to know about what we saw from the weigh-in yesterday, and then make sure to stick around for the end of the video where I'll be giving you guys my predictions on what to expect from the actual fight later on tonight. Now we'll start with what we sort of saw from the weigh-in yesterday, the overall sizes of these guys. We'll start with Jake Paul. Now, just like sort of all this fights that we've seen from him in the past when he fought Deji, AnesonGib, most recently Nate Robinson as well, Jake Paul has the clear size advantage here. Now, these two guys only weighed in about a half a pound apart, but Jake Paul has 3 inches in terms of advantage in terms of his height. He's also got 5 inches of advantage in terms of reach. So definitely the clear size advantage as well. Now, Jake Paul clearly picks these fights really, really well. You know, he went into this picking, obviously, the smaller guy, and we'll talk about the type of fighter that Ben Askren as well, which gives Jake Paul, in my opinion, a slight advantage in some of these aspects, which could play a big role tonight. But really, really similar in terms of frame compared to the fights we've seen Jake Paul have in the past. He's got that size advantage, which he really, really does use. You know, he's a very aggressive guy in terms of wanting to play on the offense, and it makes some of his opponents, even though they have less experience, it makes their opponents sort of have to play more defensive. They have trouble getting towards Jake Paul. That's why Jake Paul's been so successful in being able to knock out his opponents. Now, in terms of the size of Ben Askren, you're getting the smaller guy, 3 inches smaller, 5 inches less of reach, as I was just mentioning before. But the big story of yesterday's weigh-in was sort of the shape that Ben Askren is in. Did not look like he did a lot in terms of trying to get his core intact, but you know, that could have just been in order for him to meet the weight requirements of this fight. Because he did have to put on 20 pounds in order to be right at that same weight as Jake Paul, because I think he was 170 before and 190 after. I could be wrong on that. But overall, yeah, he does not look in phenomenal shape. Even what I've seen from his training, he did not look phenomenal in terms of the way he was striking and the overall stature of him. But the real advantage that Ben Askren has here, and I think not a lot of people are talking about it, is he does have the advantage in terms of cardio. He's obviously coming from an MMA background, and you know, I do think he definitely has the advantage over Jake Paul in terms of cardio. So if the fight, as we'll talk about later in my prediction part of this, I think if the fight does get later on, Ben Askren starts to get more and more of an advantage, but I'm really curious to see how the size difference plays and affects this fight, I think really early on in the first couple of rounds. When you look at the type of fighter that Ben Askren is, obviously coming from the MMA world over to the boxing world, never had a boxing match in his career, and because of that, I think, you know, we're gonna see a real underlying issue here with Ben Askren, which is his striking. And even when he did fight in MMA, you know, anybody who followed his fights or follows the MMA world in general knows that he's not a good striker at all. He's not very good when he's standing. And even when he was fighting MMA fighters who also weren't good at that same thing, he always seemed to be a little bit worse than them. And now you're fighting a guy against Jake Paul who, although has never fought a real fighter, definitely has the more experience in terms of actual boxing matches. I think that's a real issue here for Ben Askren, and I think Jake Paul definitely has the advantage in the main part of boxing, I think, which is the striking aspect of it. In terms of Jake Paul, the one thing you got to look out for, I think, is the cardio part of Ben Askren. He's definitely got the advantage over Jake Paul in that aspect from what I've seen in Ben Askren's previous fights. But I think Jake Paul, you know, the other thing you really got to worry about, and the thing I'll be watching early on in this fight, is just the overall boxing IQ. You know, in the fights that Jake Paul has had so far, he has looked like a smart fighter, but he's also been able to be on the offensive for essentially, you know, every single round that he's been in the ring. He's fought guys like Deji, you know, Nate Robinson, and AnesonGib. None of those guys know anything really crazy about fighting in the boxing world. And even though Askren has never had a boxing match, he still got that fighting IQ, having fought in MMA and being quite successful in there as well. So even though I think Jake Paul has the advantage early, I think Jake Paul is going to be going for that early round knockout. Watch out for Ben Askren, the way he fights, the way he tries to make this, I think, match develop out. And I think that's going to be a big telltale to see how Ben Askren can progress into later on in the fights, because I do think he has, you know, the advantage again later on in the round. So now for my predictions. Well, first of all, in terms of odds, Jake Paul comes into this fight, I think at the time of me filming this video, has a minus 180, so he is the favorite in terms of Vegas by a decent margin as well. Who I think is going to win this fight and who I want to win this fight is a little bit different. In terms of who I want to win this fight, I mean, straight up, I am not a Jake Paul fan. I don't like the way he carries himself. I think he's a Conor McGregor really wannabe. I'm not a fan of Jake Paul. But in another aspect, thinking about the fights that he could potentially get down the line, at the end of the day, I really want to see Jake Paul get a real fighter. A fighter who's, you know, fought before like Ben Askren, but more from the boxing world, more experience, more of a real boxing fighter than I think Ben Askren is. You know, if he loses, I think Jake Paul could end up getting a fight against KSI, no problem. But I think he's going to end up fighting KSI whether he wins or loses this fight at some point down the line. So part of me wants Jake Paul to lose just because I don't like him, but part of me also wants him to win just to see him fight down the line. In terms of overall favorites, I think I'm leaning towards Jake Paul. I'm going to go with the Vegas here and say Jake Paul knocks him out in round 2 as my prediction. I do think Ben Askren has some value there, though, being the underdog. You know, we've never seen Jake Paul fight a real fighter, so to get, you know, a guy from the MMA world, a guy with more overall fighting experience as an underdog here might not be the worst in terms of betting favorites. But I do think Jake Paul with the second round knockout. But if this does progress past, you know, a couple of rounds, Ben Askren, I think, does have the advantage. So if that does get past, let's say, like the third round, then I'll take Ben Askren potentially with the decision. But anyways, guys, if you did make it to this point in the video, thank you. Let me know your predictions on this fight down in the comment section below. Who do you think is going to win? Is it going to be Ben Askren or is it going to be Jake Paul? Let me know that down in the comment section below. If you did enjoy today's video, make sure to leave a thumbs up, subscribe to Touchdowns to Home Runs for more content just like this. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Hope to see you again next time.